Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are here to talk with our honored panelists who have spent their time. They're squeezing us in to talk about racial justice. The panel's topic tonight is coming out for racial justice and how do we understand racism both within and outside of the LGBTQ community and really highlight those experiences that are unique to very core members of our community. So without further ado, I'm going to give a chance for the panelists to introduce themselves. Can you share a bit with our audience about yourself, what you do, and how it pertains to the LGBTQ community, as well as your pronouns? I should introduce myself as well. My name is Hua Win. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm happy to be the moderator for today. So, yes. Who would like to start?
Well, I'll go first. Well, my stage name is Ravion Star Alexander St. James. My pronouns are he, his, and his. I think I said it right. I'm the current reigning Miss Athens Pride. I'm also a Pride Navigator for the Fort Valley State University. What else? I'm also an entertainer as well. Yeah, that's pretty much me all wrapped in the nut.
Hi, my name is Lauren Kelly, and I am a doctoral student at Kansas State University. My research focuses on intimate partner violence, Black feminism, and queer and trans justice, social justice, and rights. I'm a licensed therapist, marriage and family therapist, and I have a predominantly queer and marginalized practice.
All right.
So my name is Tigra Mayana. I use they, them pronouns, and I currently serve as the director of the LGBTQIA Resource Center at Georgia Tech. I'm Latinx, I'm queer, identify as trans, masculine, non-binary, and white. I'm originally from Nebraska, but most recently I was in Minnesota where I worked at other higher ed institutions doing LGBTQ student support services. And so that's where a lot of my background and experiences is working for student support services in higher ed.
Let's get the ball rolling a little bit, get our audience to start understanding what we're talking about tonight. So what are some experiences that might underlie a person who identifies as LGBTQ and also is a person who's Black, Indigenous, or a person of color?
You want to go first, Mr. Greaves? Go ahead.
Okay, so the question was, what's the underlying, say the beginning part, I'm sorry, Will?
Sure thing. What are some of the underlying experiences of identifying both as LGBTQ and as a Black, Brown, Indigenous, or person of color?
Yeah, so intersectionality and multidimensional selves. So really what that means is multidimensional selves is the more marginalized identities you have, the further discrimination you might experience in the world. Intersectionality looks at the intersection of racism and sexism. So for me as a Black woman, I exist very differently in the world. Adding on to that a queer identity, it's another layer of marginalization. And so it impacts how I see the world, it impacts how I interact with the world, and it impacts how the world can interact with me. I'm cis, so people don't look at me and say, oh, assume I'm straight, or well, no, they definitely assume I'm straight. So it's a very heteronormative world. So what heteronormative means is that we all assume that everyone's straight. And then it's like, oh, you're not, therefore you're this exception to this magical rule that I don't know who made up, but somehow it exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I read this question, it seemed like it was prompted from my own experience. And I always talk about how hard this is for someone like me who is Mexican, but I don't necessarily identify as a person of color because I regularly get read as kind of white by white people. And so I know that I don't really experience like day-to-day discrimination that many of my BIPOC siblings face as a result of their racial identity, particularly as it's attached to kind of colorism. So for me, my main experiences are those moments where I'm in a larger LGBTQIA community, particularly if it's more white, and they'll maybe say something racist or say something that's like more of a stereotype because they assume that there's not a person who will push back against that stereotype or viewpoint. And so I find myself often doing a lot of education and correcting and challenging of kind of racist assumptions. That happens a lot. And then the other experience that I have is kind of not feeling deeply connected to kind of white LGBTQ spaces, so like kind of larger, more institutionalized spaces, and also then feeling a little disconnected from BIPOC spaces, because I think for me, there's a reality that I bring this whiteness into the space just by the result of what I look like phenotypically, right? So like my presence brings whiteness that isn't always welcomed or accepted, and I get that. What I was trying to say is that, so when I try to go to BIPOC spaces, I get pushback because I get checked a lot for not being a person of color, which I get because I think that there's a reality that phenotypically I'm not read as either Black or brown or Asian or indigenous. And so I don't think it's that I feel invalidated. I think that there's just some challenging to the experience that I bring as someone who doesn't experience kind of colorism and day-to-day discrimination as a result of skin tone. And so I recognize that, and it's one of the reasons that I don't anymore kind of put myself into BIPOC spaces, but I will like try to do anti-racist work, be recognized as an ally, and then oftentimes I'm invited to be in those community spaces because people start to develop trust and a relationship with me, which I think is necessary and needed when you like kind of live this duality of being someone who like ethnically would be person of color, but maybe phenotypically isn't. And then I like equated a lot. There's a line in the Selena movie for people who have seen it. I don't know people who haven't kind of at this point. But she talks about being not Mexican enough for Mexicans and not American enough for Americans. And I think that really highlights the duality of my experience, both in terms of like queer identity, but also just like racial experience of not particularly fitting in kind of either space. And so it's just kind of this constant navigating of the margins. Among Indigenous folks, there's a lot of Indigenous folks who are read as white as a result of colonization and just the dynamics of what their experience has been, particularly within North America and the United States. I think oftentimes too, kind of some of the markers that we attach to experience are related to class. And so if you're a person of color who's experienced a lot of class or educational privilege, I think that can shape your experience a little bit to make you feel not as included. So yeah, I think experience is complicated. How we navigate our identities is complicated, and all of that kind of exists at these intersections of it's going to be a challenge for everyone in different ways. And so this is the way that it's challenging for me, is like just navigating the world as someone who's regularly not read as someone who has Mexican heritage.
Well, for me, being that I am a Black gay male, first and foremost, I've noticed a lot of racism that may sound crazy within the community. And it's just a lot of, it's not enough unity in the community. I mean, everybody's just cutthroat every which way, and it's just horrible. But there are some good things as well. They're all not bad.
So I guess I kind of want to follow up on that. You know, I feel like you two are talking about this where it's you're in the queer community, which is supposed to be this safe space for everyone, right? Regardless of what experiences you have, etc. But then there's also this marginalization, as you talked about, or this experience of not of being treated differently because you're as a Black and brown person.
Yeah.
So what is that sort of like? Being in a community that you do feel safe in some ways, but then also
for me, it's very weird and uncomfortable because I've never experienced it. I'll say in the regular world, I've never experienced it, but I've experienced it more in the gay community. And it's very uncomfortable. And it's not like they'll just blatantly come out and say, oh, we don't want to do this with you, or we don't want you to be a part of this because you're Black. They'll kind of like tap dance around it, and it takes a very smart person to kind of figure out, like, I think I've just been, yeah. So, it happens a lot.
And I feel like a lot of times people treat justice as like pie, right? So if I have justice, that means that you, Ravion, that means that you all somehow cannot have justice. And so it's this constant pursuit to win, as if everyone can't also win together. And I think within the queer community, it's and not just like, I think in any community, any marginalized community, I feel that there's so much discrimination, there's so much hatred, there's so much me versus you, us versus we, right?
Yeah.
It's so much of that happening in our society that when you get into these groups, you're like, well, we should be coming together, but it's like, no, I gotta protect me. I gotta protect me and mine, right? And so it becomes these like cliques within this massive group.
Yeah, and then you tend to put up a guard, and then your whole disposition just changes, and it's so not who you want to be, but I mean you have to because it's there.
Yeah.
Othering or marginalizing because, you know, similar to my example from the previous one, you may not find queer spaces that are particularly like inclusive of your POC identity. And you may also not find POC spaces that are like 100% inclusive of your queer identity. And so you're kind of constantly navigating, you know, am I comfortable with the racism that's like systemic to queer community, or maybe some homophobia, transphobia that's not systemic, but is also present in POC community because these things are embedded everywhere. And so I think it's just like this constant duality of trying to figure out, you know, like, what is my most salient identity around this issue or on this day or, you know, in this time of my life. And that's kind of where folks navigate themselves. With my work on college campuses, I find that a lot of QPOC folks are in POC spaces because they see them as being more affirming. Their racial identity impacts their experience of higher education in ways that maybe a queer or trans identity doesn't. And there's growing acceptance and a lot of acceptance amongst their POC peers around queer and trans identities. And so I think that there's this myth that people of color are not as affirming or supportive of an LGBT identity. And that's what it is, right? It's a myth. And I think I see that in the work that I do with students, the work that I see happening off campus in different communities where you have more queer and trans folks of color in kind of POC movements, POC organizations, than they are in these kind of larger LGBT movements that are very, very white.
Are there times in which it feels like different minority groups, like the queer community or people of color, get sort of framed as being against each other or get put in a position where we're almost like inner fighting rather than supporting one another?
Absolutely, yes. that is totally it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think once again, I think it's how can I protect me? And I think obviously I'm speaking from experiences not my own, but from some of my clients that are trans, right? Or some of my clients that are non-binary. It's this, where can I fit within this group? I think, once again, I'm not trans. But within the trans community, there's sometimes feels like this tension of if I'm identified as non-binary, if I don't present a certain way, what does that mean for people who have fought and have gone through all this discrimination, all these things to identify the way that they need to identify? Is it taking away from me? Is it diminishing the message? And then once again, I think it's a critique on the larger society that gets played out in these really marginalized places.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Totally agree. That's pretty much how it is.
Good point, because I feel like it is that larger society that kind of pits us against each other, and not seeing how at the end of the day it's sort of the white heteronormative cisgender, you know, like that's still like those are the spaces that are, those identities are given more space than being different in these other ways.
Yeah.
And another thing I've noticed too, is like with I just say the gay community, it's like we don't support our trans sisters and brothers enough. It's like you have trans here and then you have gay. Like it's all one. Like it's very divided. The trans people always seem to be the ones that get whatever's left or left last. And if you know a little bit about your history, a trans woman fought for our rights that we have this day. So they should be celebrated, not left behind. It's like they went through all the fighting and all the craziness to get us our rights. And once we got our rights and got established, it's like, okay, well, we don't need you anymore.
I also had a Black trans woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful point. Yeah.
So it's very complicated to be gay nowadays. Just to be yourself in general, it's very complicated. Especially when you're a brown person, it's very complicated.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you know, I think this kind of leads us to our next question. When you talk about these complications, um, how are the different ways in which racism might affect people who are queer or gay, people of color, if you're Black and you're gay, or if you're Black and you're queer? What are some of those complications, and how might racism play a role in it?
Pretty much what I stated earlier, like, it's very discriminative. Like, you get discriminated, like, for instance, I guess I can go ahead and say this. I do shows as well. I've actually seen, well, I've been in a situation where it's been pretty much like I'm a Black entertainer, and pretty much I got the gig if a white Caucasian entertainer couldn't do it or didn't want to do it, then it was given to me when I asked to do it first. But it was like, oh no, we gotta wait for such and such, you know, to see. I'm like, okay. And when they didn't want it, then it was presented to me. Well, you have the gig now. I was like, oh, okay. So we were on the same caliber of entertaining, so there's nothing else left to think but just that.
Yeah.
So this question is challenging because I thought the easier question almost is like, how does it not affect queer people of color? I think by nature of being people of color, like racism is a little bit connected to that experience, particularly for folks who like are read as. So I think for me, the question was like, how do they not experience racism? And then I was trying to think of like, what are all of the ways in which people experience it, right? You experience it while dating, and like dating apps, when people talk about like preferences, particularly related to people that they do or don't want to be in relationship with. Even how we talk about our experiences as LGBTQI folks, it's like based in a very Western kind of European way of thinking about gender, sexual orientation, sex assigned at birth. Like we separate all of these things out to create identity labels. And that doesn't take into account the way that, you know, Indigenous communities, communities of color have been like recognizing multiple ways of being for a very long time. And so, yeah, I was just thinking it's kind of embedded everywhere, and folks can experience, you know, racism both at the individual level through discrimination, at the community level, at the systematic level. Yeah, and then it's further complicated when QPOC folks hold other marginalized identities of being poor or disabled. Non-English speakers experience, you know, like huge marginalization just because of a lack of maybe like good English speaking skills. And so, yeah, it's a challenging question to answer all of the ways in which queer folks of color are affected by racism, because I think it's just kind of systemic.
So racism is the fabric of this country. This country was built on racism, and slavery, while in its most heinous form, ended via the Emancipation Proclamation or 13th Amendment in 1865. Civil rights was passed in 1964. That's like 56 years ago. And so when we're talking about racism, when we're talking about anything, we have to also talk about racism. Because this country, obviously there's brown people, but the way I think the country views people, it's black and white. And if you're Black, bad. If you're any amount of Black, bad. If you're any amount of white, that's just right. And so in looking at that, how could it not affect marginalized groups? How could it not impact the queer community? When we think of Stonewall, right? We don't necessarily think of I forgot her last name. Marsha, help me. Oh my gosh, what's her last name? Thank you. How did I forget that name? Marsha Johnson. We don't think of Marsha Johnson. Usually we think of maybe Harvey Milk, right? And why is that? Why is that the first thing we go to? Once again, Harvey Milk presented as white male, right? And so we have to understand that every lens we have, whether it's about gender, whether it's about sexuality, whether it's about any of the isms, is founded and rooted in racism.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it is. And being that I'm from the South, it's even more crazy here.
Oh yeah, Florida, right? Fort Valley.
Now I work for Fort Valley, but I live in Macon. But I'm in middle of Georgia, so yeah. And we all know
Wow.
the history on this area. So yeah.
Yep.
It's a mess. And my thing is, like I tell people, I'm not racist because it's some white people I don't like, some black people I don't like. If you're just crazy, you're crazy. Crazy is not a color or a gender, it's just that person. So some people, Caucasians I like, some Afro Americans I like. It depends on the person. But everybody's not the same. And you can't walk around treating everybody like, just because this person made you feel that type of way, you need to treat everybody like that. That's not how it works. Everybody's different. All Caucasian people are not racist. Yeah.
So I want, this isn't one of the questions, but I wonder if we can go in this direction for a little bit about sort of region, and, you know, how being in the South and being in Middle Georgia, and, you know, there's this idea of hospitality, right? We're welcoming to everyone.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, right? And so I wonder if we can just talk a little bit about that, just being in the South and what that might be like as a queer Black and brown person.
Like I said earlier, I've never dealt with racism outside of drag, just being who I am myself. It was more in my community, my supposed to be safe haven. Never ran into an issue like that. And that's the sad part, because it happened in my community. My supposed to be safe haven more than anything.
So I feel that racism looks different regionally. I've had the privilege to live in a few different states, New York, North Carolina, Georgia, and now Kansas. And as a Black woman, I think I experienced racism a little differently. Not that it's not overt, but I think it feels a little bit more covert. I also have the privilege of education, and so with education comes power. But for Blackness, right, it's just this weird dichotomy of how do I exist. And so what I've come to realize, and what I think I found, is that racism in the Midwest looks a lot more covert. Right? There's this I think ideology like, oh well, we weren't part of the Civil War, therefore we can't be racist. And going back to my original point that this country is inherently racist because that was its inception, right? And so it looks more covert versus someplace maybe in the South where it's a little bit more overt. But I also think that when we think of racism, we think of macroaggressions. When I mean by macroaggressions, it's the really big things. So people calling you outside of your name, people crossing well, maybe that's a little bit more micro, but really big today. I'm blanking. But I think it's the microaggressions that are the most damaging, which is maybe if a Black male's walking in the street, I hold my purse a little bit differently. Or I say like, oh, you speak so well. You talk like you're white. I thought you were white. It's like, what is that implying? You're so articulate. I get that all the time. I'm articulate. Well, what do you mean that I'm articulate, right? And it's the implication that because I am Black, therefore I should be less educated. Because I am Black, I shouldn't be able to do X, Y, and Z. When people find out that I'm about to be a doctor, they're like, oh, wow, your team must be so proud. You're the first person. It's like, why is that your first assumption? Or, right? And so those are the microaggressions that people are like, oh, we're not racist. Yeah, I have all these preconceived notions based off one thing I see about you. That can easily happen with queerness, right? I identify as bisexual, so that means that I'm attracted to everyone, and like, no, that's not how that works. Like, this is not how that works. Or because you're this, you're that. I mean, it's so many things that we just normalize, but no, they're microaggressions, and it's harmful.
Yeah, it's very stereotyped, and for me, I think my escape for the heterosexual community is because I'm gay. And I'm an entertainer, so I'm more approachable than just if I was just a regular straight Black guy, if that makes sense. So, I don't get normally when I see a Caucasian woman, she's all about oh, well, hey, she feels more I'm more approachable to her because I'm a gay black male. So that's kind of been like my little shield. I think had that problem.
Yeah, I think historically people associate being gay with being more feminine, right? That may not be true. Right? That may not be true at all. But yeah, but that's how people see us. Oh, because you're gay, therefore it's like, wait, what?
It's very stereotyped. Like they just stereotype things. Like people will say, "Are you transgender?" I'm like, no.
There we go. Yeah.
So yeah. So yeah, you get put in so many boxes like it's Christmas. Like, okay. Yeah, my thing is I'm a person that if I don't understand something, I'm gonna ask questions. Like that's normally how it works. If you don't understand it, don't just sit and assume and just like, oh, that's what it is. No, ask questions.
Absolutely. I think maybe in some ways when it's more like both of you talked about a little bit about when racism is more covert or subtle, that people are trying to avoid being seen as a racist. They're trying to avoid being seen as homophobic or transphobic. So then they don't want to ask the question where it's sort of like, well, what? Let's talk about what you don't know. That's okay to not know, but it's not okay to assume and then to try to maybe cover it up or try to avoid thinking about things that might be uncomfortable to
Yeah, they'll say something like, "Oh, I have a black friend that's gay," and then they go to misgendering people, and come to find out it was an actual trans woman that they knew, but they said, "I have a black friend that dresses up." Like, no, it's a whole trans woman. So yeah, it's all of that.
And I think this might be a good time to, I feel like we're kind of starting to go in that direction of our last question, which are, we talked a little bit about people asking questions and learning. So what are some of those ways that we can better support racial justice within the LGBT community as well as a whole, large outside of the community as well?
So I think, I'm trying to take like an educational approach to answering this question. So for someone who like truly doesn't know what they can do, is kind of how I'm phrasing my answer. And one is just learning more, right? Like there is so much information online, and even just doing a Google search and like being critical about some of the things that you encounter when you're doing that search. But there's a ton of information online. Following people on social media, whether it's the local person who's serving as a panelist for this discussion or other folks that you find on social media that kind of do work at the intersections of LGBT identity and race, or just exclusively work around racial justice and racial equity. Be aware of what's happening, not only locally, which is important, but nationally and globally, because globally, LGBT issues, racial issues are impacting folks across the world. And so being aware of what those look like. And then I said, supporting causes with your time or your money. I know for some queer and trans folks, like limited financial resources, but maybe you have the time to do things. Maybe if you don't have the time, you might have money. And then pushing back against discrimination, particularly racism, when you recognize it, when you encounter it, when you see it in your family, your friend groups, constantly being that kind of challenger and pusher for the folks around you to do better. And then the last thing that I said is not only attending events that center LGBTQI plus identity, it's like going to that march or that being in solidarity with folks who are strictly there for, Black Lives Matter or Indigenous rights, and it has nothing to do with your queer or trans identity. I mean, it does because they're all connected, but it's not explicitly a queer or trans event. And showing up for those, like you do queer or trans events, I think is equally as important.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think the first thing is that just because a person is marginalized does not mean that they're your educator. It's very different if you come to a lecture that I'm hosting. It's very different if you sit in one of my courses and I'm teaching about it, right? It's also different if I'm out to dinner with my friends. Like my role in that moment is not to teach you how to be better or how to be more comfortable by my existence. Right. And so in doing that, I think before we go any further, the first thing we have to talk about is not having marginalized people work harder for us. Right. And so once again, if a person is offering that up, then that's a very different conversation. And I think vulnerability is the first thing. I don't expect people to understand everything. I don't understand everything. There's things that as a person with a PhD, as a therapist, I get wrong. And when it happens, I'm like, you know what? I've messed up. And I learned that, right? It's also not my job to be like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. It's like, okay, we got it. Right, let's move forward. And so having space for yourself to know that you're not always going to get things right, that you can get things wrong, but then you learn from those moments, right? Know better, hopefully we do better.
Yeah, and that's the thing with people. People are so afraid of making mistakes. No one's perfect. It's okay if you make a mistake. Everybody's trying to be so perfect. It's okay. You make a mistake. You do better next time. Like, it's okay. Like, people are so anal when it comes to that. Like,
absolutely. And I think in that I hear you, you know, this idea of when you're making the mistake, but then not apologizing so much that it's almost like you put it on the person of color to then say, you know, make it better. Like, oh, it's fine. Yeah, like, yeah, exactly. So it's sort of like then you make the mistake, you acknowledge it, you think and you do the work, you do the self-work to be better and to, yes.
You just have to, I'm just so grateful I have an open mind, and I don't, a lot of people say they don't see color. I don't see ignorance, and I don't see stupidity, and I don't see just plain dumb.
Yes, and what are so in that, what are some other ways that we can support racial justice within the community that may, you know, the educational, the self-teaching is important.
Yeah, talk about it. You have to face the problem. You have to face the monster, so to speak. You have to talk about it. You have to make people aware and come together and come up with a solution on how to make it more comfortable, because me personally, I don't think it'll go anywhere. But you can kind of like find ways to kind of avoid it, or, you know, how to handle it if you were to ever be in the incident, how to handle yourself.
I think it could also look like accountability. And so, and I think it's difficult, right? I just did a talk the other week about the difference between not being a racist and being anti-racist. So not being a racist is like, I'm not going to discriminate against you, Ravion, because you're Black. I'm not going to be nasty to you. I'm not going to discriminate against an Asian person or a queer person because of that marginalization. Being anti-racist is doing that, obviously, but it's also keeping the people in my spaces accountable. So if I'm at a dinner party and I hear a friend make a slur that's derogatory towards queer people, then that's me going to that person. What did you mean by that? Why was that acceptable, right? And keeping it accountable. I think it's difficult. It's not easy at all. But things won't change if we don't keep systems accountable. Now, it also looks like keeping larger systems accountable, right? So obviously, I hope this airs before the election, but going out and voting, right? Voting, it's helpful because that's the larger system. That's dictating these laws. That's dictating healthcare. That's dictating queer rights. That's dictating marriage equality. All these things are being dictated. That's holding it accountable. Please don't tell me you love me and you care about me, but then do things harmful behind my back. It doesn't mean much, right? That's lip service. It doesn't mean a lot to me for you to say that if you're not also living that. If you love people, if you care about your family members who are marginalized, then show up for them in the ways that matter.
Yeah, and I think everybody needs to vote. You know, we're so hell-bent on, well, my vote doesn't count. What if it does? I mean, how would you not know? Like, I mean, it's not like pulling teeth. It only takes like 2 minutes. So what if you have to wait in a long line? Good things come to those who wait. So, hey, I'm willing to wait for it and do my vote and pray that everything goes the way I want it to go, and just hope I'm not right this time around, because I honestly feel like I just feel like Trump's going to get a second term. I hope I'm wrong. I never want to be wrong more than now. But I kind of feel that. I hope not. But I'm going to vote, and I hope everybody else votes. And, yeah. And pray. Pray, vote, keep praying crossed.
Absolutely. Pray, vote, take action, whatever. And I think that's there's always that risk, you know, there's always that risk. And that may not be a risk to if you're not part of the queer community, or if you're not part of the the Black community, there may be different kinds of risk for you, but
Right.
do think about other people that you are connected to, that their rights and their humanness are at risk with this election. So
Yeah, and I found out because I'm actually a part of a campaign called Drag the Vote. That in, I think 2016, if I'm not mistaken, there were so many, I say rainbow people, all those alphabets is too much for my tongue, did not vote. And I'm like, okay, so we are the people here, like pretty much at the bottom of the totem pole, trying to get this and trying to get that. Why are we not voting? Like, that's your first move, to vote. Once you vote, then your voice will be heard, and you can let them know what your commands are, what you want to see, what you want to change. You got to vote first, y'all. You're doing it the other way around, like, you go this way. Vote. Every vote counts.
okay. So are there any final thoughts or comments you'd like to share before we end the panel?
No, just next time, if y'all want to have me, please let me know ahead of time, because I love to talk, and I would have had myself prepared, and I'd have been just yep. I can go on and on and on, but I am very grateful for you guys wanting to talk to me and have me a part of the time. This is very exciting, and I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I too am very thankful to be here. And I'm thankful to get to have this platform to talk to people and to hopefully educate and normalize and support people that are marginalized. So I thank you for this. I thank your organization for hosting this Pride. It means a lot. Visibility matters, representation matters, equity matters, justice matters. All these things matter. And so without people, without organizations like this, without people like you listening virtually, you all matter. And so I thank you for even taking this time to listen to us talk.
Yeah, and thank you for everything that you're doing, because it's people like you that we need more of to make an impact. So thank you so much to you and the community and everybody. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. And I say on behalf of our organization, I'm sure the rest of the audience, that we so appreciate your time. I know you're both very incredibly busy, and it's so amazing to hear from you, and for you to share so openly with us. And we're incredibly grateful and honored for that.
Yeah, I'm real busy, but I'm never trying to pass up a chance to do something positive. Like, I don't care what I'm doing, I'm dropping it and I'm doing it. So, yeah.
Awesome. And vote, everyone. Vote.
Yes, vote.
Yes, go vote. Vote. Your voice matters, honey. Don't sit around saying, oh, my vote don't count. What if it does? Vote.